All right, shall we start? The beautiful music, sorry for interrupting it. Good morning, good afternoon, partners, colleagues, everyone. Welcome to the 12th webinar of the ODA Learning Series, co-organized by OECD and UNDP. My name is Saran Selenge. I'm very happy to welcome you all to this webinar today. And it is a very special webinar because we have not only do we have two very distinguished speakers and you distinguished audience, and we have our very own Ivan here to moderate today's session. Ivan Zerzhanovsky is here with us, who leads the partners team here in UNDP's Istanbul Regional Hub. Ivan, can I hand it over to you?
Thank you very much, Saran. Good morning, colleagues. It's a really big pleasure to actually be moderating this session on a particularly important topic, both for, I think, all of us and myself personally. So we have been organizing these workshops, as many of you know, since 2014, and I'm really happy to see that despite the challenges of the COVID pandemic, we have actually managed to move this online and to make it as, if not even more successful than they were in the past. So today, I think we have a really amazing opportunity to discuss some of the more complex parts of the impact that COVID has been having on our societies and our economies. As many of you are aware, UNDP has been working with the governments globally on assessing the socioeconomic impacts of the COVID crisis and supporting the preparation of recovery plans. We do also then through this see the immense impact that COVID has been having on the economies and societies, looking at an expected shrinking of the economy in 172 countries, extreme poverty set to increase for the first time in over 20 years. But then if you look at it also more closely, these impacts have not been uniform across countries and across population groups. So what we can see from, for example, IMF studies is that the measures to contain the pandemic have had a disproportionate effect on the most vulnerable workers, and in particular on women. So, women in the pandemic usually work in the front lines. As you all probably know, 70% of professional doctors and nurses in the health sector globally are women. Women on average around the world provide 3 times more unpaid care and domestic work than men. And women also face higher risks of both income loss and increased violence and abuse. So recognizing all these facts, I think it's particularly important for us to then look at what measures can the development sector have in mitigating those impacts, and using this also pandemic and the recovery from it to promote greater gender equality and empower women to reduce the effects, negative effects that the pandemic is having on them as a particularly targeted group. So without further ado, it's a huge privilege to introduce our 2 distinguished speakers today. Professor İlpek İlkaracan is a professor of economics at Istanbul Technical University at the Faculty of Management, and is also a research associate with the Levy Economics Institute in New York and the Economic Research Forum in Cairo. She is the associate editor of the Feminist Economics Journal, and her research areas entail the care economy, gender and macroeconomics, political economy of gender, and labor markets and development. Our second speaker today, Eva Johansson, is the lead policy advisor for gender equality in the Swedish International Development Corporation, SIDA. She also co-chairs the OECD Development Assistance Committee, DAC's Network on Gender Equality, GenderNet. Eva comes with over 20 years of experience working in development cooperation, humanitarian assistance in SIDA, as well as in the UN system, including the working on UN disaster assessments and coordination team, UNDAC, working with UNICEF, UNFPA across various regions of the world. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Professor İlkaracan for her intervention, and then we will move to Eva, and then we will open for questions and answers. I think as usual, please also post your questions in the chat function on the side. We will collect them for the end as well, but you can also, of course, ask them directly at the end of the presentations. Professor İlkaracan, over to you.
Okay, thank you for this introduction. And I'm very happy to be addressing this platform, which I find quite important, consisting of representatives of ODA. So today I want to, in the limited amount of time that I have, which I believe is about 10 to 12 minutes, I would like to share a perspective on COVID-19 through the lens of what we call the care economy, which has been an emerging topic of study and research in the past, I would say, about 2 decades in gender and economics, and also in various subfields of economics, such as macroeconomics and development economics. The care economy, actually, Ivan has already given some insights into it in his opening, so I was happy to hear in terms of the impact of the COVID. So if we start with an overall definition, it is that part of the economy which is usually quite invisible in economic policy discussions and in the general overall context of economics, which focuses predominantly on the market, on production and consumption of market-produced goods and services. But the care economy overall entails the production of and consumption of goods and services necessary for predominantly physical, but also social and emotional well-being of, first of all, care-dependent groups, primarily children, elderly, ill, and disabled. But not only that, also the care of healthy prime working age adults, including self-care activities, so as to allow people to function at a socially acceptable level of capability, comfort, and safety. Now, it has a huge unpaid care work component, as was already mentioned by Ivan in the introduction, and also a substantial amount of this care economy production takes place in the market economy, where the public provisioning also plays a predominant role through paid care work. So when we say the economy, the care economy, and of course it's important to quantify this, the unpaid component, according to an estimation by the International Labour Organization in 2018, consists approximately of 16.5 billion hours per day of unpaid work. And as we all know, the majority of it is performed by women on as a global average, about 3/4. In the Turkish context, for instance, where I'm based, about 89, close to 90% performed by women. And that 16.5 billion hours per day of work time, actually, when you divide it by an average 8-hour working day, corresponds to approximately 2 billion full-time jobs. And I would like to put an emphasis on that because what I will be talking about for part of this presentation is that unpaid care work has a huge potential, actually, for job creation through public policy. The paid component is also substantial, close to 400 million workers, around 12% of total global employment. And again, as Ivan mentioned in the introduction, predominantly women are in the front lines of this paid care work. About 2/3 of, as a global average, 2/3 of employment in the health, education, domestic work, and personal services sectors are women. So what happened with the pandemic? With the pandemic, one of the things, one of the immediate observations we had was the impact on paid care work, and also the impact on unpaid care work. So in both these components, actually, there has been an unprecedented increase in demand for production. So in the case of paid work, the demand for healthcare has undergone an immense increase. There was also an important structural transformation of educational systems by converting to online education. And overall, this meant that both in the health and education sectors, actually the workers, particularly in the health sector, but also to some degree, as studies show, in the education sector, there was a substantial increase in work hours and a deterioration in work conditions. On the side of the receivers of these services, what we see is an increase in socioeconomic disparities, particularly amongst children and the ill and care-dependent groups by socioeconomic status. On the unpaid part, the demand for household production also increased substantially. There was an enormous increase in unpaid work, and a lot of qualitative evidence from around the world has indicated that, with pointing in the direction of gender disparities. When I talk about the COVID impact on the economy from a care perspective, I mentioned that the standard headline, newspaper headline or media headline in the economic news in the initial months of the COVID was that the economy came to a halt. It came to a stop with the pandemic. I say it depends on from what perspective you're looking at the economy. What is your definition of the economy? If you look at what happened under COVID-19 to the care economy, leave aside coming to a halt, on the contrary, there has been an unprecedented explosion of demand for production in both the paid and the unpaid components. So how did this, given that in both the paid and the unpaid components, the majority are women, how did this impact the gender disparities? We undertook a survey with the support of UNDP Regional in Istanbul and UNDP Turkey, a research to explore what happened in the unpaid component. And this was one of the actually few pandemic time use surveys, as we call it, that was conducted around the world. There was one conducted in the UK, one in India. So there were a few around the world, and Turkey was one of the handful time use surveys under the pandemic conditions. This was undertaken in May 2020 with a nationally representative sample. And what we saw is, first of all, and what you're seeing here are the change in weekly work hours with the pandemic. And they are definitely at a on the minimum side due to some of the restrictions of the comparison to the pre-pandemic survey. But what matters are the relative changes between men and women and post-pandemic and the pre-pandemic. So first of all, what we see is that the unpaid workload overall has increased by 1.6 hours for women, close to 1 hour for men, and overall close to a 1 hour increase in the unpaid, in the gender gap in unpaid work. Despite the increase for both women and men, given that the increase for women was more than men, we see an overall widening of the existing gender gap in unpaid work, which was already substantial to begin with in the Turkish context. With respect to paid work, we see a decrease both for women and for men, but more for the decrease for men is close to 2 hours, whereas it's about half hour for women. And one of the important reasons for this is because the majority of the women were employed in the front lines, in the care sectors, in health and education sectors. So what we find is relatively less of an employment disruption and more of an increase in employment paid work hours of women under the pandemic. Overall, what we find is a further widening of the gender gap in paid work by about 1.5 hours. And what happens when we look at total work as a summation of unpaid and paid work is that the total workload of women is on the increase. Of men, on the contrary, we see a decrease with the pandemic. And overall, when we look at the gender gap in the total workload, paid and unpaid, we see a change from a minus to the advantage of women to plus to the advantage of men. So with women overall working about in the post-pandemic era, working more than 1 hour than men. An interesting finding that we had is when we disaggregated women and men with respect to employment status under the pandemic, and with women who continued in employment despite the pandemic conditions, what we found is that their unpaid work as well as paid workload has increased, and the increase in their total workload was more than the average. Whereas with men, while the unpaid workload increased to a lesser extent than women, the paid workload decreased and the total workload decreased for men who continued in employment. But for men who switched to telework and started working from home, the decrease in paid work hours was more substantial, close to 1.5 hours per week. And their contribution to unpaid work, we observed, was actually higher than the average, around 1 hour to more than 1 hour, particularly in households with small children. When we asked the participants in terms of how they felt about their total workload, paid and unpaid, under the pandemic measures, the share of women who said that they found it very difficult and felt exhausted was 50%. So 1 in every 2 women. In terms of men, it was less than 1 in every 4 men. And again, when we disaggregated the results by employment status, we found that close to 2/3 of women who continued in employment under the pandemic felt exhausted and found the total workload difficult to cope with, versus 27% of men. So overall, these results show that, first of all, I mean, they're quantitative evidence of how much the unpaid workload increased across all groups, but particularly for women, and how the increase in the total workload, particularly for women who continued under pandemic conditions, who continued in employment under pandemic conditions, has been particularly trying, which obviously has implications, negative implications in terms of their labor force attachment. As the stress of the total workload intensifies under COVID-19, it is more likely that women's labor force attachment becomes weaker, and the labor supply constraints become enhanced. But beyond this, we had 2 other interesting insights from this survey. One of them has to do with men. What we found is that when men are provided with more flexible work forms, paid work forms, such as reduced employment hours and ability to continue their paid work from home, their contribution to unpaid work has the potential to increase in a substantial manner and in a short period of time. This, I think, challenges the view that the gender division of paid and unpaid work has deep cultural origins, and that it is more in people's minds, and that we need changes in social and cultural attitudes for a transformation to take place. What we're observing in the Turkish context, where we have one of the highest gender gaps in unpaid work in the OECD, and also from a regional and international perspective, is that men actually are able to change their behavior and contribute more to unpaid household production if there is the need and if they have the ability to do so in terms of work-life balance. Another interesting insight was that the inequalities in unpaid work time amongst women by socioeconomic status or by education level and household income have actually been reduced under the pandemic. And the main explanation for it is that the purchasing power of households and of women, which is a reflection of affordability of market substitutes for household production, became somewhat more irrelevant due to stay-at-home measures under the general pandemic context. So these have important policy implications, particularly in terms of work-life measures that are focused on men, and also in terms of how the pandemic maybe presents us with a historic opportunity for all groups, both women and men, and households of different class backgrounds, socioeconomic status, to appreciate the importance of care work and of unpaid care, and hence providing us with an opportunity to bring forth care policies in a stronger manner in this context. And the policy implications and the concrete policy suggestions are taken up in a policy brief that has been published by UNDP in summer 2020. So overall, then, why care about the care economy? This was, as I said, has been an emerging topic for economic research and policy discussions in the past 2 decades, but with increasing urgency under the pandemic and the pandemic-related economic recession. So first of all, as we've seen, unpaid work constrains labor supply of workers with care responsibilities, particularly of women. So it further deepens under the pandemic conditions, gender economic gaps in paid and unpaid work. So from a caregiving perspective, but also one thing that we didn't talk about from a care receiving perspective or the perspective of care dependence, it also fosters inequalities amongst care dependents. So we've also seen that many national care systems are not resilient in the face of shocks, and the pandemic has actually shown or unveiled the urgent need to strengthen, first of all, healthcare, also improve access to effective online education or safe access to education and childcare for all children and parents, particularly for working employed parents. The need to improve access to safe and long-term care services for the elderly and the disabled, and also the need to enact care leave and effective work-life balance work options, particularly for employed men and women with care responsibilities. But beyond that, I would like to bring in another perspective, a macroeconomic perspective on why we need to care about the care economy, and particularly under the pandemic-triggered economic recession, is because based on some recent research, we also knew that the care economy or public investments in the care economy offers an immense opportunity for job creation and inclusive growth. And this is all the more important in the current context where we are observing an unprecedented increase in unemployment rates around the globe. So previous research has been undertaken in numerous countries, starting from the late 2000s, South Africa, USA, Turkey, high income and middle and low income economies, including China, India, and Brazil, a 2018 research by the ILO on 45 high and middle income countries, in which I have been involved. The circled ones are the lines of research that I was involved in undertaking. Recently by OECD and UN Women in Kyrgyzstan and Macedonia, and also Ghana and Tanzania. So what these applied research studies do is they undertake policy simulations on the macro and microeconomic impact of an increase in public expenditures, in fiscal spending, on social care services, and I call it social care services infrastructure, because similar to physical or communications or technology or energy infrastructure, actually having a social care services infrastructure is also a component, an economic input that improves productivity in the short run and over the long run. The recent research studies have shown this. And infrastructure is an economic input, macro level infrastructure that enables increased productivity. So in that sense, social care actually has that infrastructure characteristic to it. So what these applied policy simulations do is they compare the relative economic impact of public spending being allocated to social care services infrastructure vis-a-vis other lines of spending. And one of the common lines of comparison is physical infrastructure and construction spending. And the comparison is done in terms of employment creation, economic growth, poverty reduction, and equality by gender and socioeconomic status. So in the Turkish study, some of the forthcoming findings have been, first of all, that social care services spending has the potential to create more jobs than physical infrastructure, construction spending, by a factor of minimum 2.5, almost close to 1 million jobs, if in the case of, for instance, childcare services becoming universal. It also has a stronger potential in poverty reduction. In the Turkish context, we found that the poverty reduction that would be enabled by increased childcare spending, for instance, was as high as 1.4 percentage points versus a maximum of 0.5 percentage points in the case of construction spending. And also gender equality. So the employment generation and the poverty reduction outcomes are in a more gender equitable level, because social care spending creates relatively more jobs for women, hence enabling narrowing of the gender employment gap, whereas construction spending also creates jobs by less than social care services, but also in a manner of widening the gender employment gap. And also these studies typically look at the fiscal feasibility in the short run in terms of increase in tax revenues. And in the Turkish case, we also find that social care spending, because it creates more jobs and depending on public policy, more formal jobs, it also has higher tax revenue or tax revenue returns and self-financing potential. Okay, so I'm not sure how I'm doing with time, but
it would be good if you could start maybe wrapping up because running. I mean, we still have a bit of time, but it would be good if you could start wrapping up. Thanks.
Okay, just last 2 or 3 slides. The ILO study in 2018, for the ILO, it was actually a big report by the International Labour Organization, which was called Care Work and Care Jobs for the Future of Work. And one of the 5 chapters of this report looked at the potential of the care economy to generate new employment globally into 2030. So to that end, we undertook a simulation similar to the country level simulations for 45 countries, 45 high and middle income countries, all of the OECD countries, plus a number of middle income countries, including India and China. And the simulations compared this time not social spending on social care services to construction, but rather it was a comparative framework that took the year 2015 as the baseline and looked at the likely outcomes of what would happen in 2030 if the 45 countries in the simulation, which made up approximately 85% of global employment and over 80% of global GDP, if these 45 countries would just sustain their level of social care expenditures in education, healthcare, including long-term care, elderly care, and including early childhood education, if they were to keep their spending constant, stable, without attempting to increase their social care spending, versus which we call the status quo scenario, versus if they were to take the high road scenario towards fulfillment of multiple sustainable development goals in education and health and decent employment generation and gender equality. So we had policy targets made up of SDG 3, 4, 5, and 8. And what we found was that even under the status quo scenario, due to population increase and due to the demographic transformation towards aging societies, even keeping the social care spending as a constant share of GDP, there would be 152 additional jobs created directly in the care sector and also indirectly in the other cares in the other sectors through backward linkages of the social care services sector. So with the total care employment increasing to approximately 358 million. But if these 45 countries were also to increase the share of social care spending in these sectors, we found that there would be an additional potential for jobs generation up to 120 million new jobs, taking the total number of jobs to almost 500 million in these 45 countries. So the report also entails detailed estimations of the gender composition of jobs, with more than 50% of the jobs being allocated to women, and the amount of spending, additional spending necessary, which we find actually not such a huge amount, and additional spending of approximately 2.5 to 3% of GDP is able to achieve the SDG objectives into 2030. To wrap up, investing in the care economy was always an important part of efforts or strategies towards inclusive growth. But now under the pandemic, it has become ever more urgent, and it needs to be a fundamental part of recovery efforts for improving the resilience of national care systems, for relieving the unpaid care time constraints on labor supply, particularly of women, and at the same time for stimulating decent jobs generation, decreasing unemployment rates while keeping labor force participation strong, and fostering inclusive growth. Now, an important macroeconomic intervention point here that we need to emphasize has to do with the fiscal stimulus packages that most governments around the world are designing. And now with the second phase of the COVID pandemic, there are new fiscal stimulus packages that are being designed and put into effect around the globe. So the question of where to allocate fiscal stimulus spending from a gender-aware perspective has a straightforward response: definitely the care economy. And this actually is in line with pre-pandemic an emerging emphasis in the pre-pandemic era in macroeconomic policy discussions by the Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, for instance, and also by UNCTAD, who in their assessments of what is needed in terms of macroeconomic policy interventions with respect to the ongoing economic recession and stagnation is investment in labor-intensive service sectors with future productivity returns, and they emphasize healthcare, education, long-term care, and childcare services. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been, I think, a fascinating, and very data-driven, which I think is very important overview of what we are facing. So I think it really segues nicely into our next speaker, where Eva, I would like to give the floor to you. We always, look at SIDA's leadership on these topics in particular. So look forward to hearing your intervention. Then we'll move to the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for the very interesting and, as you mentioned, data-driven presentation. I perhaps will not be as data-driven in the presentation, but there's a lot of underlying data, of course, in our development cooperation and humanitarian assistance. So the theme here today, and my name, by the way, is Eva Johansson, so I'm SIDA's lead policy advisor for gender equality. And as you know, SIDA is a member of the OECD, and we are also, of course, having a feminist foreign policy, and actually, as of quite recently, also a feminist trade policy. And yesterday we had a very interesting seminar, a global event on how to integrate gender in economic development, and in particular in trade. So that's a YouTube link that perhaps colleagues can share with you. So coming back to this presentation then, mainstreaming gender in ODA, you can actually turn to the next slide. SIDA has, or Sweden, let's say Sweden has really followed and driven also the policy of mainstreaming gender in ODA, and as a member and now a co-chair also of GenderNet, this is a very important policy issue for us. You can stay with that slide. And in the recent peer review, this was also highlighted. That's why I'm using these figures, which were in the peer review of Sweden, saying then that 20%, this is the gray slide, gray piece of the pie, is dedicated to gender equality, targeted to gender equality. This is rather high in comparison to the average, which is more closer to 4%, but there's a great diversity between countries. And many countries, Canada and other countries, are really in the forefront. So, and I'm happy also to say that there are many countries now that have even declared themselves as feminist countries, or that have a very strong focus on gender. So it's a very positive, I think, development. You can turn to the next slide. We have as an overall objective at SIDA, I'd like to show this picture because the bottom line is really that we aim for people to live in poverty, but also under oppression, to have the ability to improve their living conditions. And these two words, poverty and oppression, is really guiding our work. And we have two perspectives in all our development cooperation, and that is a poverty perspective and a rights perspective. So that's why I wanted to highlight these two avenues. And in addition to that, we have a gender equality perspective, environment perspective, and also conflict perspective. So So that's sort of the underlying thoughts behind that green overall objective. And as I mentioned, we have been, or maybe I didn't, but we have been working with gender equality for many years, both internally in Sweden, but also in our development cooperation. And although we are in the forefront in many areas, there's still a lot, we are still on a steep learning curve, like all countries are. There's always new persons joining CEDA. There are new thoughts and ideas and experiences. And there's always new thematic areas and data that are coming forward. So to really build on an evidence base that was mentioned before, but also to drive policy change, we have just recently, a few weeks ago, adopted a new gender action plan for the coming 3 years. So I just wanted to share with you that, because I think it's very easy to say that Sweden, for example, or some other countries are always in the forefront, but it takes a lot of innovation and to really be able to take in all new themes and to take in all opportunities, able to address also the new challenges. So that's why we continuously have to reinvent the wheel, so to say. And our objective for the coming years is really to, this is not showing everything that Sweden does or CEDA is focused on. This is just a few strategic shifts at what we will dig deeper into and become better at. So CEDA's gender mainstreaming is well developed. And this means, we'll come back to that, what it means, but also on emphasizing that our gender equality work is strong, or even in difficult environments and contexts, and represents an important counterforce against the growing opposition to gender equality and women's and girls' rights and empowerment. So there's a few sort of key words there that we'll come back to and what it means. And it has relevance also in particular for the COVID-19 response as well. And our approach, as we all know, normally we use when we talk about gender mainstreaming, we talk about a twin track or a dual approach, which is something that we completely support, which is basically here in our words expressed as integration and targeted. But we also add emphasis on the dialogue, and that's dialogue with partners, dialogue within programs, donor coordination at country level, but also a global advocacy and normative dialogue. You can change, please. Next slide. This is digging a little bit deeper into the 4 shifts, and the first one is, I'm going to go through it rather quickly. You can always come back to ask questions. But the first one is the strategic shift is that we need to continuously increase our knowledge and capacity to act. And we as an agency want to shrink the gap between really policy and operations. And that means also that we have to, I just had to turn something off here because it's making a sound. We continuously have to increase our knowledge about gender mainstreaming, and there's a very interesting work going on within the OECD DAX network for gender equality on developing or updating the standard on gender mainstreaming. We're also doing that internally within our own organization, challenging our concepts and developing methods. And we also need to have a stronger focus on learning and evidence base. We are developing now, for example, an e-learning just to make sure that the basic concepts are really well known. Because sometimes we jump to a very high level in our training and even perhaps think we don't need any training anymore because it's really in our bloodstream. But experience has shown and evaluations has shown, yes, we need to continue to have a continuous approach to learning, building on an evidence base. And part of that evidence base and learning, but also e-learning, is that we have included in our gender action plan to prevent and respond to sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, which is another priority that the OECD DAC, with the new recommendations since last year on SEA, has put forward. So we have integrated SEA in our gender action plan just to make sure that we are making that strategic shift. And the second area is the counteract against gender equality. As we know, in many countries there are it's a pushback against gender equality, and this is something that we have to ensure that we support those actors that really are the change agents, be it women's rights organizations or youth. And we also engage in more strategic communication to counter the backlash. And then we have 2 areas which we are particularly strengthening, focus on gender in. Of course, we have a strong focus in social sectors, in education and in health, for example, but there are a couple of other areas that we need to also integrate more. And that's the humanitarian conflict and post-conflict, and I think it's the same in most countries. There's a lot to do there, and many opportunities. And there we also come into the COVID-19, the C-19, just to make sure that we are not only addressing this sort of usual humanitarian conflict and post-conflict situation, but also prepare our development cooperation to address gender in COVID-19. And the last bullet point is then the focus on economic development and financing. And this is also linking very nicely with the priorities of the OECD DAC GenderNet that are developing a new framework for economic empowerment, but also addressing the opportunities to work much more on financing and financial actors. Development banks, but also private institutions. You can turn to the next slide. I hope I'm not taking too much time. So these are a couple just of, this is how our guidance tools looks like. They are pretty much internal, but they are available on our website. And we actually right now, almost as I speak, updating our gender toolbox. And we have a toolbox which contains information to our program officers on policy markers. We have tools that are thematic, that can address, for example, gender and trade, also providing dialogue issues, because as you recall, in our approach, we have integration, and we also have a targeted approach, but dialogue is very, very integral to our gender mainstreaming approach. That's why we always try to include that when we develop our tools. So what do we offer? We have a policy specialist and advisor. I'm SIDA's lead advisor, but I also have 2 colleagues that are working together with me. And then we have regional advisors. For example, in our Africa department, we have 2 full-time gender advisors, and they support in turn our staff in the field. In the field, meaning in our case that SIDA has staff in the embassies. And I'm sure many of you have met some of those. So we have a network where we meet usually monthly. Within SIDA, we meet much more often. We have a gender hub, but in the wider network, including the embassies, we meet once a month. And then we also have, which is very helpful, and not in the least, is the burden on the advisors. We have the availability of a help desk, and that's very easy to draw upon. You just send an email to our help desk, and they can provide that, short-term assistance. And it's very, it's not bureaucratic or administrative at all, very, very straightforward. It doesn't cost anything for the user. And then we also have a framework agreement. If you have longer consultancies, you can very easily make a framework call. And then we have the Gender Equality Action Plan, the new one that I mentioned. Please, next slide. If you look at the implications of COVID, I already mentioned it's really one of the priorities that we are addressing now. And this is just to show that it's a really high-level issue to address gender in COVID. Gender equality was perhaps not featuring in the absolute first appeal so strongly, but after that, there's almost been a landslide of commitments from the UN Secretary General, the UN Women's Director General, UNDPs, and other international partners, OECD, DAC, of course. And it really shows that you really need to put gender equality in the forefront, not just of development cooperation, but also when it comes to addressing and succeeding to build back better from a crisis such as COVID-19, and putting women and girls at the center. And UN Women has, for example, taken the approach also to address the shadow pandemic, as they call it, which is of course violence against women and girls. Next slide, please. And if we look at the implications of COVID-19, I know that some like to address particularly one or two of these. Gender-based violence is of course in the forefront. I'd like to say in gender-based violence, we also include, we should always include domestic violence and gender-based violence online. And in particularly gender-based violence online is something that's really exploding, in particular as people are turning much more to in their homes with the lockdown, and that creates all kinds of situations and the opportunities that are being exploited. We also have an increase of SEA, sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. What I mentioned in the development cooperation, that's something we have to be very much aware of and take into consideration. And with the digitalization, we have the opportunities and risks. There are not only risks that I mentioned with the GBV online, we also have opportunities. And I mentioned that of the CEDA's two priority perspectives, poverty and addressing oppression, the one on the top, increased polarization and shrinking democratic space, is something to be very much aware of course, but also address in the COVID response, because we see that there are situations where this is being taken into advantage. With the COVID-19 crisis and the space that already has been shrinking the past years has really become serious in some countries. So this has to be part of the COVID-19 response. And of course, we know that women are in the front line of COVID-19 as caretakers, but also as decision makers and in other capacities, and women are in the front line and are therefore could also be particularly vulnerable, but also needs to be empowered in that situation. And the increased domestic burden that was very elaborately addressed, so I don't have to go into that. And one issue that Sweden is always putting in the forefront, and I want to do it now also, is the access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. And this is something that previous pandemics and disaster have shown us. Women don't have access to health centers in the same level as before during a pandemic, because of the way that the health system is stretched, but also on priorities. And this really needs to be part of the COVID-19 response to ensure access to reproductive health and rights in a crisis such as this. Next slide, please. You have to highlight if I'm taking too much time. I'm going to just highlight a couple of why I show this picture is because women's economic empowerment is one of those areas that through the COVID-19 response that we need to also address, in addition to what I mentioned, GBV and SRHR and those other areas. But I just wanted to highlight one here. And why I'm highlighting this is is because economic empowerment is really one of those ODA areas which is so under-resourced in by many donors, and there has also been a shift in our Swedish with the Swedish Gender Action Plan, that we've decided to focus much more on this. And also, I'm sure that you all are aware of the Generation Equality campaign that is running now, with UN Women spearheading it, with Mexico and France and other countries, which is a very innovative approach, and bringing in also youth and other marginalized groups, and reigniting, I would say, commitment for gender equality, the generation equality, is having as one of the 6 priority areas is women's economic justice and empowerment. And Sweden is, together with other countries and stakeholders, are leading a global action coalition on women's economic justice. So I just wanted to highlight that, take the opportunity. And that's a whole set of, I think there, OECD DAC is very well placed also, and you have written policy documents around these areas and what the impact are. There's, with the risk of recession, well, it's not a risk, it is an economic recession. There is also a risk of increased poverty, and we are seeing that on a large scale in many countries. And there is also a risk that when the reforms and packages that are being launched and developed on a macro level in countries, gender risks to be one of those issues that could be left behind, and we need to be very much aware of that. We cannot launch economic recovery programs and reforms and bringing gender at the later stage as an add-on. This needs to be really in the early stages and need to be factored in, because it's such an opportunity if you really address women's economic empowerment. And I think Susanna Moorhead yesterday in the seminar that I mentioned, she put forward that the global GDP could increase by 20 to 30%. So it's really makes economic sense. And this is the justification, in addition to, if we need justification, to include. We also have the risks of the global pay gap increase. It's already there. And of course, many women are in the informal sector. The majority, in fact, are women in the informal sector. And there was a recent report that shows women that the percentage is actually increasing quite steeply. And women are, with the COVID crisis, and women are most vulnerable to that. Social protection has been lifted as one of those areas that are, or the lack of social protection is one of those vulnerable areas that needs to also be addressed. And the opportunity when social protection programs are drawn up to have a gender dimension is very important. Unpaid care work was already mentioned. And digitalization as well. One area which I highlighted there is the importance really to address the issue of loans and access to financial resources. It's one of those areas where during a crisis, the general access to loans and the general access to financing is diminishing, and women are of course at risk of losing out here. So I just wanted to move to next slide and
I have to ask if possible to really
wrap up
because we're actually out of time. So if you can just kind of 1 minute wrap up, and then thank you.
Yes, I realized that. So so we have at SIDA developed identified entry points to integrate gender equality in COVID-19 based on what I just described. And we have developed a thematic brief and a tool, a dialogue tool for our colleagues at country level. and this can be made available to you as well. But the most important is the first one, of course, having a gender analysis in all assessment and situational analysis, and being evidence-based, addressing risk, but also opportunities, even during a pandemic such as this. And then engaging in the advocacy and dialogue with partners. And one of the key areas, I would say, of success in SIDA's Sweden's COVID response is that we have provided, normally we provide whenever possible, core support to our partners, and that allows them to be flexible and to provide that response that is so urgent in a crisis, and also engaged in donor coordination. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if you have any questions, feel free to address them.
Thank you Eva, very much. And you know, I think it was a really fascinating overview of how SIDA and Sweden are integrating gender into the COVID response. So I think a lot of information there for colleagues, especially from the other ODA agencies. And we already had some you know, requests in the chat box for, you know, further document sharing. Some of them were already shared. Because we're out of time, I do have one question I do want to ask here that was posted even prior to the webinar. So maybe this is also a possibility for both of you just to kind of address this question and wrap up like in the same kind of 1 minute attempt. So Joe Crawford is asking, how do you consider gender should be integrated in measurement, example of poverty, inequality, etc., so that it helps to reveal gender disparities and intersectional disadvantage? And can it support gender responsive policies and programming and resourcing, and help track how ODA is translating into changed lives for whom, especially in response to the pandemic? So it's really about, you know, do you have any quick tips on measurement? And then your final thoughts. So Eva, we'll go to you and then.
Yeah. Thank you very much, John Crawford. I'm familiar. We are, as the second last slide showed, what we are strongly recommending to have, of course, sex and age disaggregated data. This is the data that is usually available at country level, but it doesn't really show the measurement on the intersectionalities. And I should have mentioned that, it was in my notes actually, that marginalized persons and communities are really the ones at greatest risk. And if you look at the elderly, for example, those with underlying conditions, or migrants, or LGBTQ communities, we have many. It varies between countries and within countries as well. But inequalities have really been one of those factors that has surfaced during this pandemic, and it really shows that the pandemic really hits at the core of inequalities. So I think this is an area where we really need to jointly engage in developing good tools and measurements. But in terms of statistical data available at country level in our countries, there is very much still a focus on the sort of basic data, but addressing inequalities is something that's really important. And we're also supporting UN Women's flagship program on gender data, and then they are. This is a global work that we need to do to try to be much more better at and measuring inequalities. We are taking in, we are having an intersectional approach in our gender analysis in an increasingly, and this is something that I strongly recommend also that we continue working on. This is maybe you can repeat the second question again. How the resources are leading to changed lives. We are continuously evaluating our programs, and we are just launching now in January a thematic overview of the key areas that we are working on in gender. to look precisely at how our investments or resources, what impact are we actually having, and how are we using the right methods or the recent data to really drive change. So I think that's a very, of course, that's at the core. We do want to have a change. We want to change in terms of the poverty and also the oppression, and we are following quite closely the programs that we support. And this is something that we also, through our dialogue that I mentioned, follow much more closely and have interact with our partners and engaging in learning. It's really a learning experience and experience sharing that we actually put a particular focus on in our gender action plan, to engage much more in that, to make sure that we are really making a change in people's lives and in women and girls' lives.
Thank you. Professor Ikaranjan, over to you for final remarks.
Yeah, let me focus actually on the first part of the question, how to integrate gender into measurement of poverty, because it's a topic that I've been working on actively in the past year in terms of my research. There are a number of time and income poverty measures that have been developed recently, which actually provide us with an opportunity to have a gendered approach to poverty. Time poverty, basically, as distinct from income poverty, is an indicator of the lack of access to time after subtracting time that we need for sleep, basic hygiene, and self-feeding, and subtracting the paid employment time and commuting, the leftover time, if that is below a certain time poverty threshold, which is basically set by the required minimum amount of required time that one needs to take care of a household, depending on the characteristics of the household, depending on how many children and adults you have and how many care dependent adults you have. So if the amount of time left over is below a certain time poverty threshold, similar to an income poverty threshold, then we define that individual and that household as time poor. The Levy Economics Institute has developed a combined measure of that takes account of both lack of access to time necessary for household production and lack of access to income for purchase of market commodities for subsistence, and combining that, so it converts the time deficit into US dollar terms, or into a monetary value, by multiplying the time deficit with the average wage of wages paid for domestic work. So combining these, then we're able to come up with a combined time and income poverty measure. And what is interesting about this gendered way of looking at the phenomenon of poverty, that also includes unpaid work time and household production as component of welfare, of a household's welfare, is two aspects. First of all, it shows that there's a significant amount of hidden poverty, particularly for women and female-headed households, because the combined time and income poverty rates are substantially higher than the official poverty rates, that is based only on income poverty. And the second very interesting implication, which I think has important gendered insights, is that when the studies show, when you provide all the people living in income poor households, all the eligible people living in income poor households with a full-time job, then if your measure of success of reducing poverty is the official poverty rate, the income poverty rate, then providing full-time jobs shifts a substantial number of poor people out of income poverty. But if your measure of success is a combined measure of time and income poverty, then a substantial number of employed people in income poor households continue to remain under the time and income poverty threshold. Why? Because while through employment they're able to access jobs and labor earnings, they are at the same time suffering from increased demands on their time, and they start lacking the necessary time for household production and to take care of the household. So this effect is particularly dominant in the case of women. And what we find in the various countries studies is that as the paid employment hours of women and men increase from part-time to full-time to over full-time, the time poverty risk that women are exposed to about 10 to 20 times more than that of employed men. So that in itself tells us why women are more reluctant to enter the labor market and why they have a much weaker labor force attachment. It's after all a rational cost-benefit analysis on behalf of women, particularly low-skilled women whose wages in the labor market are low and whose the type of jobs that the type of full-time jobs that they are employed into require very long work hours plus long commuting hours. That employment brings some cash income, but then throws them into such time poverty that the overall well-being is reduced. This is a newly innovated measure, the time and income poverty measure. The one that's why the Levy Economics Institute has been the most widely used and applied in different country settings, including some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. This is something that we may consider in that respect.
Thank you very much. This has been a really fascinating and I think really rich presentations that I'm sure all of our participants enjoyed as much as I have. And I think it's a really important topic and so much more to be unpacked here in the complex nature of the impact on gender and what we can do more of, both in terms of measurement, but also how does this feed into our policy response. I would just like to note you have a comment in the chat section for both of you from our regional gender advisor, Bharati. But because we are out of time, I would like to thank you again for this excellent presentation. Thank all our participants, and hope that this is just the beginning of a conversation and discussion around how we can really increase the impact of our work on reducing gender inequalities. So thank you again for your time. Thank you for these excellent presentations. I look forward to continuing this discussion with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivan, and thank you, Eva and Ipek, and for wonderful presentations and great discussion. I think if we extended the time, I think we would just, easily go on half the day. So I'm very afraid that we have to close because we are out of time. And I would like to kindly remind all of you about two things. One, please register for the webinar next week on Thursday, same time, 11 a.m. Istanbul. We will have a very special webinar focusing on ODA providers, how they deploy development expertise, various modalities and opportunities and challenges that poses for development systems providers in our region. We will have cases from Russian Federation, Romania, Czech Republic, and we will have also experience on the ground from Tajikistan. So please do join us next week. And it would be fantastic if I may ask you, so please prepare also your cases to share with us. We will be devoting 1.5 hours next week. So It would be fantastic if our partners could bring your examples to share on development expertise. And my second part of the comment was, since we are nearing the end of our ODA learning series, we would love to hear from you how you would like to continue the conversations that we have started through our weekly webinars. And we will have a section on the survey for the webinar, what you would like to see more of or less of, and how you would like to follow up. And we will have a dedicated discussion on our very last webinar on 26th of November. So please do let us know your thoughts and ideas through the survey. And looking forward to see you all next Thursday. Thank you very much on behalf of the organizers. And thank you very much again for joining us today. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.